relation to chemical weapons. And so there's weapons there, there's equipment, there's old protective suits, and both these bunkers have been hit by 2,000-pound bombs by the United States. One of them unexploded in the middle of the bunker. So the question now, and it's an ongoing discussion amongst all of us, is how do we address this? It's a very dangerous situation. You don't want to get anybody killed. How do we access the bunkers at this point? These are big, as I said, the size of a soccer field, and they're 3 stories high. How do you access them? And the cost estimates just on accessing them, you know, drilling holes very carefully and putting in cameras and sniffing devices and measuring to see if there's live agent you can identify in there. Just the whole evaluation and monitoring effort is thought to be like $500 million, because you need high security. You have to build a whole military base there first to build security on these sites. I mean, they're really heavily concreted in, so it's very unlikely anyone would really get into them. But there's a whole discussion about how do we destroy these bunkers, which you need to do under the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the Iraqis and the Americans are talking about concreting them more, just pouring more concrete, kind of really sealing them up like the pyramids in Egypt. You know? And we've said, but you know, the convention specifically says you can't dump or bury your stockpiles of your agents. You have to destroy them in a safe and sound manner. And so if you're going to rebury them, you know, here, maybe the states parties will agree to that, and maybe it'll be safe to do that. But you've certainly got to set up monitoring perimeters so that you can monitor the groundwater and monitor if any of this stuff is leaking and getting it, which it probably is, getting into the groundwater and the like. So that's a whole other issue. And then Syria will come to later. I'm not going to go through these lists at all. These are the Russian stockpiles. You can see the different tonnage there and what's been destroyed. Russians are making very good progress. Russians have destroyed per year almost twice the amount that the Americans have. So the Russians have destroyed about 30,000 metric tons in 11 years, and the United States has destroyed 25,000 metric tons in 23 years. So they've gone much faster, largely because their weapons are much simpler and easier to deal with. They're not as dangerous. All of our weapons, most of our weapons in the United States have rocket propellant and explosives in them, and everything has to be, every building we build at these facilities has to be armored, you know, with 3 feet of concrete and rebar and all the rest. So it's big, expensive operations, and we've spent 3 times what the Russians have had to spend too. The U.S. program, the only point I'll make here is, you know, the first 7 there are all finished, all the way from Johnson Atoll to Newport, Indiana. And the last 2, Pueblo was built, and we'll begin, it's systematizing now, which means they're testing all the different, got 375 different systems they have to coordinate and begin to operate correctly before they introduce live agent into it, endanger everybody. And Bluegrass is about 65% built. Bluegrass, Kentucky, right upwind of the Kentucky Derby. And that'll begin operating probably around 2018, maybe even 2017 if we're lucky. I think 18 is likely. It may not finish till 2023. That's the last stockpile to be destroyed. So let me just go through a few challenges and make a couple of conclusions, and then we can open it up for discussion. Number 1 is cost. Nobody ever dreamed how much all this would cost, and I think people who built these weapons back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s would never have dreamed that it would cost about 1,000 times more to destroy them than it was to build them to begin with. And the first U.S. cost estimate, you'll see there in the first bullet, was $2 billion. And now we're approaching, as I say, $40 billion. It's still rising. It's just enormous. And your military guys, military colleagues, always say to me, Paul, why are we spending all this money on an environmental cleanup program? You know, and I said, well, it's not really completely an environmental cleanup. It's actually destruction of a whole, you know, class of weapons of mass destruction. And we're destroying them largely because they're dangerous, they're leaking, somebody could steal them, and we don't want to spend all the money it costs to just keep security on them, you know, for the indefinite future. So, but it's a big project, big procurement project that's come under Nunn-McCurdy, if some of you know that, the legal limits to cost escalation in procurement programs, and has been under attack a lot of times. We're worried now, about keeping the money flowing, particularly for the construction of bluegrass, to keep it on schedule, at least the current schedule, because of sequestration and the whole budget, morass in Washington, D.C. The Russians have also, escalated tremendously, and it doesn't include what I call non-stockpile, which are buried chemical weapons, I'll mention in a minute, and sea-dump weapons. We haven't talked about those, but I'll show you a picture of that soon. Technology. There's been loads of debate over what's the safest, best, most cost-efficient technology to use. And the military, the U.S. military, I think, never dreamed in the 1980s and 90s when they built the first prototype incinerator that people would maybe oppose destruction of the stockpiles because of incineration. But incineration in general, if any of you study environmental and public health issues, you'll realize that incineration of anything is controversial. Medical waste, garbage, whatever you're doing, hospital incinerators. If you can't prove what's coming out the smokestack, that's a problem. And so, to the military's surprise, early on in the 1990s, and certainly by the mid-1990s, there was enormous protest at all 9 stockpile sites, as to what were the long-term environmental and public health impacts, and was there any risk of live agent kind of burping out the smokestack? And it turns out has been some live agent put out the smokestack, very small, really minute, but measured by the alarms at the top of the stack. Who knows if they ever did harm? I don't know. But never measured were persistent organic pollutants, what are called POPs. And so I think what happened was, in the end, 4 sites refused incineration, 4 states. And fortunately, we had a development program for non-incineration technologies that a lot of us supported and pushed through in appropriations in the mid-1990s. And thank God we did, because in fact that's what's being used at 4 of the sites. Was used at 2, and will be used at both Pueblo, Colorado, and Bluegrass, Kentucky. And the Russians had the same challenge too. When we went in '94, we offered them an incinerator. I didn't, but I mean the Assistant Secretary of Defense did. And their immediate response was, "We don't want an incinerator. You guys, if that's what you guys want to do, great. But we're not going to use it. It's too controversial. It's too high maintenance. It's too unpredictable. On and on." And the Russians are neutralizing. They're using wet chemistry, kind of chemical reagents, to destroy all their stockpiles. And then you have to go through a whole second stage process too. So none of the technologies are perfect. I've never taken a stand per se. But I have taken a stand that we need alternatives. States need choices. And so if you don't like incineration, choose neutralization. If you don't like neutralization, choose something else. But you got to destroy the stockpiles in a timely way, in a safe way. Emergency preparedness. Early on, I think neither the Russians nor Americans recognized sufficiently the fact that families and communities downwind would be nervous about potential for an accident, a major catastrophe. Release of a few gallons, or liters of live agent. And so we had to work with both the American and the Russian militaries a lot on how do you prepare. And you'll get differences of opinion on this. I think some people will tell you, "Oh, this was total paranoia. We've never had a major accident," which is true to date. But others will say, "Hey, we're lucky we haven't had a major accident. It's lucky that we did prepare." So this has been a very expensive operation. Schools have been overpressurized, bulletproof glass put in schools, sufficient food and water and cots to keep kids and teachers in schools for up to a week downwind of the facility. Buses on site to move out workers in a moment's notice, if you have to move them out. There's early warning radios here, you'll see, and the like. So that's been an ongoing challenge. The 4 is community investment and involvement, particularly in Russia, but also to some extent in the poorer communities here in the United States. The picture on the left there is a picture of one of the main streets in Syria. And you can see that's not quite as passable as some of our highways here in the United States. And so all these communities, when the Americans went in to try to help the Russians and the Global Partnership eventually went in, you had I think the stereotype in Russia that the Americans in the West were coming and they were going to drop billions of dollars out of the sky, and we need a little bit of this in our local community. And that was, understandable. And also when you go into very poor communities like Anniston, Alabama, and Pine Bluff, Arkansas, or Umatilla, Oregon, you realize those communities wanted a little piece of the pie as well. What were going to be the positive socioeconomic advantages to this? And so the Russians, very reluctantly committed 10% of their overall programmatic costs to community investment. And these have built roads, sewage treatment plants, electrical supply, new water supplies. Most of these villages never had water, actually, before. A pump at each end of the village, go and pump, and people stole the metal handles for scrap metal every month. I mean, these are really poor communities. The people I met there were out scavenging every day, for metals they'd pick up in the fields, and they'd pick up maybe enough to make $1 a day, in scrap metal. So we try to encourage both Russian and American governments to invest in these communities, certainly to train and hire local people, which a lot of them didn't necessarily, and to try to make it a win-win for everybody. The picture on the right is actually the first public hearing we held in Russia, which was 1996. And we figured almost nobody would turn out, and it turns out we packed the Dom Kultury, the House of Culture, the sort of town hall in the local community.